So while other people have been away, last couple of lessons we watched a bit of the movie, the 1974 version of Great Gatsby, and while we were doing that, we got you to create a chart, 9 chapters laid out, and although some of this stuff on the left hand side is taken from the movie, it was very similar to the book, but we are now going to look at chapter 1 more closely, do a close reading of chapter 1 and see how these things pan out. And the reason why I wanted it to be set out on this in this table format is because we can then track how different aspects of the novel develop over the 9 chapters. So the characters, the themes, the setting, the issues, all those sorts of stuff, the symbols, how they kind of appear and in different chapters and for what different reasons. So looking at chapter 1, what's interesting about chapter 1 is, and chapter 2, is Gatsby's barely mentioned in there at all, the character of Gatsby. And in terms of structure, that's interesting. So we'll talk about that along the way. But when we are doing a close reading at any time, some of the things that we're looking at patterns of language or structure to do with character. And those characters represent real people. So we'll see that even though Tom is represented as a fictional character here, we'll see that he also represents that wealthy aristocratic class of America as well. We can also see, we're going to look at how setting is established. But the setting also, and our setting, remember, is not just the place, but setting can also refer to a particular period of time. And we can also refer to a social setting. And we can think about that as a social milieu as well, is what we often call it. I'm not even sure if I'm going to spell this right, but I think that's right. A milieu is just basically meaning the social mix in which a person finds themselves in. Not just the people they meet, but also the kind of things that they do, the places they visit, the foods they eat, all part of the social milieu. So the setting not only is a fictional setting, but it also represents a real place and time. A real place, and we'll see that there's representations of the Midwest and of the East, particularly New York. But we also can look at it as a representation of the 1920s. Now, the other thing we're going to be looking for in this first chapter are the beginnings of a pattern that relate to themes and issues and ideas. And there's going to be a lot of overlap here, so the characters might point to particular themes and issues, and so might the setting. All right, so let's have a look at how Fitzgerald, because it's such a short book as a novel, it's very short for a novel, it does pack a lot of stuff in a short amount of time. So we just want to see how that happens here. So I'm just going to read through and see what comes up here. So, in my younger and more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice I've been turning over in my mind ever since. Whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, he told me, just remember that all the people in this world haven't had the advantages you've had. I'm going to just, as sort of an opening passage, let's think about that, because in terms of an issue or a theme, can anyone think of what that's already pointing to? Okay, it's already talking about class, social hierarchies. People who are wealthy, people who are not wealthy, people who are white, people who are not white. All of this is pointing to different opportunities people have had or can get. So this idea of not criticizing people is kind of developed in this later paragraph. He didn't say any more, but we've always been unusually communicative in a reserved way, and I understood that he meant a great deal more than that. In consequence, I'm inclined to reserve all judgments, a habit that has opened up many curious natures to me and also made me a victim of not a few veteran bores. The abnormal mind is quick to detect and attach itself to this quality when it appears in a normal person, and so it came about that in college I was unjustly accused of being a politician because I was privy to the secret griefs of wild, unknown men. Most of the confidences were unsought. Frequently I have feigned sleep, preoccupation, or hostile levity when I realized that by some unmistakable sign that an intimate revelation was quivering on the horizon. For the intimate revelations of young men, or at least the terms by which they express them, are usually plagiaristic and marred by obvious suppressions. Now, the main thing I take from all that is that Nick is developing himself as a fair and reliable narrator or observer of events. It's almost like a resume. This is what's happened to me in the past. People just open up to me. So he's establishing himself here more than anything. Uh, so reserving judgments is a matter of infinite hope. I am still a little afraid of missing something if I forget that, as my father snobbishly suggested, and I snobbishly repeat, a sense of the fundamental decencies is passing. I find this phrase here quite important in terms of when we first introduced this novel. Remember, we had that activity differentiating between personality and character, and we kind of talked about character being something that's internal and deep within a person, whereas personality is more gestures and superficial outward shows of a person's personality. So to me, this phrase here is kind of the fundamental decencies suggests another word or synonymous with a person's character, the positive aspects of a person's character, such as trustworthiness, reliability, responsibility, compassion, those things that we talked about as being um, positive aspects of a person's character. And these are the things that drive their behaviors with other people who they come across. So we'll see there that this idea of fundamental decency is linked also with this idea of a person's conduct. So here what we mean by conduct is how we behave in society. Do you have good conduct or bad conduct? How do you conduct yourself? So after boasting this way of my tolerance, I come to the admission that it has a limit. So I'm Mr. Tolerant, but um, conduct may be found. This is an interesting metaphor coming up here. It goes over the page, so I'll try and track it. Conduct may be founded on the hard rock, it will come to say, may be founded on the hard rock or the wet marshes. So the word founded meaning, think of foundation of a house. That's what conduct is built on. Now, if the foundation is built on the hard rock, that suggests that it's solid and it's not easy to damage. But if it's built on wet marshes, referring to conduct, After a certain point, I don't care what it's founded on. So interesting metaphor here. Is your conduct something really strong and part of yourself, or is it sort of a fragile thing or built on something that's quite unstable? Did you say unstable there, Cameron? Yeah, that's the word I was thinking of. So, and we'll be able to witness that, there's, with all the main characters, they conduct themselves in different ways. When I came back from the East last autumn, I felt that I wanted the world to be in uniform and a sort of moral attention forever. Now, notice the use of the word moral, because when we were talking about character the other week, we talked about that character can inform our morals, but also be built out of what we understand to be moral behavior. So it's really morality and character go together. So if your character includes being someone who lacks integrity, someone who's devious, then their morality allows it. But if your character is one that includes compassion, then your morality allows that as well, because you see that you should care for others who are less fortunate for you. So morality and character go together. So in terms of developing a pattern, we can start seeing this pattern around character and personality beginning to form in these opening paragraphs here. Um, so look at the perspective that he's writing from as well. When I came back from the East last autumn, so his experiences on the West and East Egg were in the summer. So after summer comes autumn. Am I right? Always get these things mixed up. Yeah, all right. After summer comes autumn. So summer's finished. He goes back to the west where he's from, and he begins to reflect on his experiences there. So when I came back from the East last autumn, he wanted no more of the riotous excursions with privileged glimpses into the human heart. So this contrast between uniformity contrasted with the riotous experiences in New York. So there's a contrast there between East and West. The West, uniform and at a moral attention, compared to the East, which is riotous in its behaviours. Riotous, uncontrollable, sort of haphazard. This is probably where he's talking about the wet marshes here as well, that it's unstable, all ready to come crashing down. Only Gatsby, and here's our first mention of Gatsby. Only Gatsby, the man who gives his name to this book, was exempt from my reaction. So in all of New York, only Gatsby is exempt from that reaction. Even though Gatsby represented everything for which I have an unaffected scorn. Now straight away we can kind of see there's a sort of a paradox here. He has a scorn for what Gatsby stands for, and yet he elevates Gatsby above all others in New York that he met. We don't need to try to understand that paradox for now, because that paradox is something that the book is really looking to explore. So this is one of the to be explored. So we see Nick, Fitzgerald, through Nick, is setting this up as a central paradox. And it'll come down to the question of character, as well. I'll show you at another time how it relates to the last chapter and these seemingly contradictory observations about Gatsby. It's paradoxical, it's contradictory. Now, our personality and character distinctions that we were talking about the other day comes up here again. If personality is an unbroken series of successful gestures, then there was something gorgeous about him, some heightened sensitivity to the promises of life, as if he were related to one of those intricate machines that register earthquakes 10,000 miles away. This responsiveness had nothing to do with that flabby impressionability which is dignified under the name of creative temperament. It was an extraordinary gift for hope. I'm highlighting this bit here because these ideas are emphasized in the last chapter. A romantic readiness such as I have never found in any other person and which is not likely I shall ever find again. No, Gatsby turned out all right in the end. It's kind of ironic here because we know now, I'm going to question mark it, because he dies in the end. And you hear he's saying he turned out all right in the end. But turned out in what sense? In what sense was he all right? He's dead after all. Somehow he's come out of it okay. It was what preyed on Gatsby. What foul dust floated in the wake of his dreams that temporarily closed out my interest in the abortive sorrows of short-winded elations of men. I was re-looking at the last chapter recently, and this imagery of a wake. You know what that is referring to? Floated in the wake of his dreams. What the wake is he's talking about there? It's got something to do with the word floated. Floated in the wake. Where else might you hear that terminology? You're going to say it, Cam. Say it. Water. Okay. So when a boat goes through the water, the waves that come behind it is the wake left by the boat. That's what he's talking about here. This is a boating imagery. It might not make sense yet, but when we look at the last chapter, there's a definite link between this imagery of Gatsby going somewhere metaphorically on a boat towards some dream, following a hope, and behind him he leaves a wake, as a boat does. But here, a foul dust is settling in that wake. So we'll get to that when we get to the last chapter. But I'm just bringing it up now. But whenever you're doing any reading of a novel like this, the first and last chapters, especially a literary novel like this one, really important in framing the whole argument, if you like, framing the whole set of ideas that it's exploring. So this is an interesting one, that it preyed on Gatsby. He turned out all right, but it was what did prey on Gatsby then? So if it preyed on him, so Gatsby is the victim, or the prey, what is it that's the predator eats the prey? So what is it that's eating Gatsby? What is it that's destroying him in the end? What's destroying his hope? Anyone? Okay. So that all sounds good to me. At this moment, we don't have to have an answer. We can just ask the question. But there are those things. Maybe it was his desire as well, not just for Daisy. is at a very literal level. He desired Daisy, but part of that desire is also he wanted to become part of that world. He wanted to become a part of that class structure, the top part of that class structure that um, Tanae was referring to. So desire to belong to a higher class. We see that later on when we learn about his ambitions in college. You know, that small college in Minnesota wasn't big enough to hold his dreams, they were saying at one point. And, you know, he would often read self help books. And so he had a strong desire even before he met Daisy. Even before he met Daisy, importantly, he had this desire that he was meant for something bigger. But maybe that's what he, in the end, destroyed him. And again, we'll see the links to this all in the last chapter. My family have been prominent, well-to-do people in this middle western city for 3 generations. The Carraways are something of a clan, and we have a tradition that we're descended from the Dukes of Buccleuch, I don't know, and the actual founder of my line was my grandfather's brother, etc., etc. I'm just going to go past this bit a little bit more quickly. He's giving background, characterization, and context for Nick's character. Um, we learn that he was a soldier in World War One. When he comes back from the war, remember the very first few lines of this chapter. He said that he wants that the stable. What did he say about the moral attention, standing to moral attention and a uniformity? He had enough into the riotous excursions of New York. But before these, he coming back from the war, he felt that using pen function. Okay, so what we're looking at there is that coming back from the war, it seemed it was a ragged edge of the universe. So I decided to go east and learn the bond business. So here we're starting to get this idea. Remember that part of the novel is going to be an exploration of the West values and attitudes and society versus the East and what they represent. Already in the opening lines, it talks about the West as being the stable bedrock of character, whereas the East is like the wet marshes, is what he was talking about at the beginning. Uh, so here he's this section here he's talking about just the logistics of getting to his new place of residence. I think what I'll jump to is where he starts talking about Tom and Daisy. We start seeing here, and we've talked about it before, this distinction between the West Egg and the East Egg, where the West Egg is the less fashionable of the two. So this is the most superficial tag to express the bizarre and not little contrast between them. Okay, he's getting quite specific here. Bizarre and not a little sinister. It's interesting, this use of the word sinister here. Why is it sinister? My house was at the very tip of the egg, not 50 yards from the sound, and squeezed between two huge places that rented for 12 or 15,000 a season. Very expensive. It's weird. So even though it's less fashionable, it's still 12 or $15,000 a season. So it's kind of expressing that it's still very expensive. And here we start hearing about Gatsby's house. So when we talk about characterization, one way we can characterize a character is not just their appearance, their clothes, the dialogue, but also the setting. So where a character lives, the cars they drive, they're part of the characterization. And here we've got Gatsby described as living in a factual imitation. It's kind of an interesting juxtaposition of fact, imitation. You think that something that's imitated is not, the real thing, fact. So it's an interesting choice of words. Like, again, this contradiction, paradox, a factual imitation of some Hotel de Ville in Normandy, so French, Normandy in France, with a tower on one side spanking new under a thin beard of raw ivy and a marble swimming pool and more than 40 acres of lawn and garden. It was Gatsby's mansion, or rather, I didn't know Mr. Gatsby. It was a mansion inhabited by a gentleman of that name. My house was an eyesore, but it was a small eyesore and it had been overlooked, so I had a view of the water, partial view of my neighbour's lawn, and the consoling proximity of millionaires, all for $80 a month. So this is an important part here, though. Later on, when in chapter 3, I think it is, when Nick goes to the first party, he meets someone in the library who comments, who's surprised that all the books in the library are real. Because there's this idea that maybe all of Gatsby is just a pretend hoax. And the drunk guy in the library at the party says, "Oh, look, there's actual words in these books." And so there's this suggestion that Gatsby's all a fake. So this is a fake French villa, because it's an imitation of this Hotel de Ville. So it started building this idea that maybe Gatsby is in some way an inauthentic or some kind of copy of something. And maybe the copy is this copy of an aristocrat that he's trying to be. He's trying to be like Tom. He's trying to belong to that slice of society. So here we start talking about Tom. Across the Courtesy Bay and the white palaces of fashionable East Egg glittered along the water, and the history of the summer really begins on an evening I drove over there to have dinner with the Tom Buchanans. Daisy was my second cousin once removed, and I'd known Tom in college. Just after the war, I spent 2 days with them in Chicago. Very interesting to see this characterization of Tom at the beginning here. Let's look for the patterns that help establish him as a character. So Daisy's husband, Tom, among various physical accomplishments, had been one of the most powerful ends that ever played football at New Haven. A national figure in a way, one of those men who reached such acute limited excellence at 21 that everything afterwards was enterprise. His family were enormously wealthy. Even in college, his freedom with money was a matter for reproach. What does reproach mean? Something that you can be critical of. Someone reproaches you, they're kind of telling you off for something. So imagine being so you're using your money, you're throwing your money around so easily that it's, yeah. So I'm trying to think of the right word here. It's kind of a little bit so easygoing with his money that it's almost when you think of character, it's almost wasteful and it's unbecoming just to flash your money around like that. So his freedom was with money was a matter for reproach. Continuing on for Tom. So far we hear that he's powerful, enormously wealthy. Oop, but now he'd left Chicago and come east in a fashion rather that took your breath away. So here again he's splashing his money around. For instance, he brought down a string of polo ponies from the Lake Forest. It was hard to realize that a man in my own generation was wealthy enough to do that. Um, And so it happened, I'm jumping a paragraph here, that on a warm windy evening I drove over to the East Egg to see two old friends I scarcely knew at all. The house was more elaborate than I expected. The lawn started on the beach and ran toward the front door for a quarter of a mile. This is just huge wealth. This is New York City, right? That amount of land, is even back then is very unusual. Let's see what else. So the imagery of him in riding clothes and standing with the legs apart on the front porch. So you can kind of just imagine this powerful, physically powerful figure standing with his legs apart. He's kind of the confident owner of this property. It changed since his New Haven days. Now he was a sturdy, straw-haired man of 30 with a rather hard mouth and a supercilious manner. And supercilious meaning he's kind of up himself. His two shining, arrogant eyes had established dominance over his face and gave him the appearance of always leaning aggressively forward. Not even the effeminate swank of his riding clothes could hide the enormous power of that body. He seemed to feel those glistening boots until he strained at the top lacing, and you could see a great pack of muscle shifting when his shoulder moved under his thin coat. It was a body capable of enormous leverage, a cruel body. I mean, in terms of positioning the reader to introduce someone as having a cruel body, I mean, really, what does that even mean? Yeah, I mean, who knows really, but the fact is that it's positioning the reader to sort of be wary of this person. Look at all the words that they use. Muscle. Mm. Yep. We might even see this as a little bit of cruelty we see from Tom later. Not only, not so much physical cruelty, a little bit when he smacks Myrtle, but there's emotional cruelty there as well, that he's willing to impart. But it's all packed into that paragraph there. So you kind of remember, so even though Nick is trying to establish himself as this reliable narrator who's a fair, non-judgmental observer of events, you can kind of see he undermines that a little bit here already when he's suggesting this Tom's got a cruel body, which is you know, a value judgment, sort of a so again his speaking voice is gruff and husky, adding to impression of fractiousness he conveyed. There was a touch of paternal contempt in it. Paternal contempt, so it's like paternal is to do with the father figure. So he's kind of looking at even people who aren't his children, he kind of treats them in a childlike way. So that's why when he's even talking to Nick, he's not talking to Nick as a equal, he's talking to Nick as like a childlike figure and that he can boss around. And this is something to do with his class again. Aristocratic class who feels quite entitled and well within reason just to speak down towards anyone not on his social level. And finally, I'll end with this little bit here. The other part of the characterization is what other people say about him. So if we don't want to believe Nick, Nick tells us there were men at New Haven who we don't know why. New Haven's going to be full of rich people, but even they hated his guts. So he's kind of using this as a final expression of this initial characterization. After this bit was Tom's words when he talks about the his fear of the black race, white dominance of America. we'll hear it from his own mouth, the kind of aspects of characterization. So what I like to do is for the rest of this chapter is have this sort of annotating and just see what other things we can come up with now. And sort of, if we go back to this first page that I came up here, we can see the time has started to be characterized and representing this group of mystery we start seeing the development of the East, Midwest and the Eastern contrast in terms of the social settings. And we start seeing ideas of personality versus character in terms of one of the themes there. The class divide and, what even what the American dream means when he talks about Gatsby having an extraordinary or infinite amounts of hope. That's referring to the American dream, which we see. Okay, so if you can just carry on and work on that, well, I won't sort of spend much more time on chapter one, except maybe when it's necessary. Okay. For those people who are watching the video, if you can go and create a chart.